My name is Sarah Martinez, and 6 months ago, I thought I had escaped the most toxic relationship of my life. I had a thriving career as senior UX designer at TechFlow Solutions in Austin, my own downtown loft that I absolutely loved, and what I believed was a clean slate after ending a manipulative 2-year relationship with my ex-boyfriend Jake Thompson. I felt strong, independent, and finally in control of my narrative. Then our company announced they were hiring a new employee relations manager to lead their wellness initiatives, and I walked into the conference room to discover that my ex-boyfriend's therapist, Dr. Amanda Richards, was now going to be my direct supervisor for all workplace conflicts, performance reviews, and professional development. The woman who had spent months listening to Jake's version of our relationship, who had witnessed his tears and frustrations about our breakup, was now in a position to analyze every aspect of my professional life. What happened next wasn't just workplace harassment, it was psychological warfare disguised as employee wellness, and it nearly destroyed everything I had worked so hard to build. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined that escaping a toxic relationship would only be the beginning of my real battle for autonomy and professional respect. Growing up in San Antonio as the eldest daughter of 2 hardworking teachers, I learned early that success came through persistence, integrity, and keeping your head down while doing excellent work. My parents, Maria and Carlos Martinez, had immigrated from Mexico in their 20s and built a stable middle-class life through sheer determination and an unwavering belief in education. They taught me that if you worked harder than everyone else and maintained impeccable character, opportunities would follow naturally. This philosophy served me well throughout college, at UT Austin, where I studied digital design and discovered my passion for user experience. I was the student who stayed late in the computer lab, who volunteered for extra projects, who built relationships with professors based on genuine curiosity, rather than grade manipulation. When I graduated with honors and landed an entry-level position at TechFlow Solutions, I felt like I was living proof of my parents' teachings about merit and hard work. TechFlow Solutions occupied 3 floors of a sleek glass building in Austin's Domain District, and from my first day 5 years ago, I fell in love with the company's mission of creating intuitive software that solved real problems for small businesses. The office culture was collaborative without being intrusive, ambitious without being cutthroat, and diverse in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. My cubicle on the 12th floor overlooked the rolling hills west of Austin, and I often found myself staring out at the landscape during creative blocks, finding inspiration in the way morning light shifted across the terrain. My role as a UX designer suited both my analytical mind and creative instincts. I spent my days conducting user research, creating wireframes and prototypes, and collaborating with developers to ensure that our software felt intuitive and elegant. The work was challenging but rewarding, especially when client feedback confirmed that our designs genuinely improved their business processes. Over 5 years, I had steadily advanced from junior designer to senior designer, earning recognition for projects that increased user engagement and client satisfaction. The promotion to senior UX designer 18 months ago came with a substantial salary increase, additional responsibilities mentoring junior designers, and inclusion in strategic planning meetings with department heads. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was being recognized not just for my output, but for my judgment and leadership potential. Director Michael Brooks, who oversaw our entire creative department, had specifically mentioned during my promotion review that my combination of technical expertise and emotional intelligence made me a natural candidate for future leadership roles. This professional momentum coincided with what I thought was a positive development in my personal life. Through a mutual friend at a weekend rock climbing meetup in Zilker Park, I met Jake Thompson, a charismatic marketing consultant who seemed to share my interests in outdoor activities and professional ambition. Jake was handsome in an effortless way, with sandy brown hair and an easy smile that made strangers feel like old friends. He worked as a freelance marketing strategist for various Austin startups, which meant his schedule was flexible and his income unpredictable, but his passion for helping small businesses grow resonated with my own values. Our early dates felt like perfect compatibility. We hiked the Greenbelt on weekend mornings, explored Austin's food scene, and spent hours discussing our career goals and personal philosophy. Jake seemed genuinely impressed by my work at TechFlow, asking thoughtful questions about user experience principles and celebrating my professional wins with enthusiasm that felt authentic. When he suggested we make our relationship official after 3 months of dating, I felt like I had found someone who truly understood and supported my ambitions. Moving in together after a year felt like a natural progression. My downtown loft in the warehouse district had enough space for both of us, and Jake's freelance work meant he could easily relocate his home office to my spare bedroom. The arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. He gained stability and a beautiful living space, while I gained a partner who could share household responsibilities and provide emotional support during stressful work periods. For several months, this domestic arrangement worked smoothly. Jake handled grocery shopping and cooking, tasks he genuinely enjoyed and performed well. He created elaborate weekend breakfasts and surprised me with thoughtful dinners after particularly challenging days at work. His presence made my loft feel warmer and more alive, and I began to envision a future where we might formalize our partnership through marriage or property ownership. However, subtle changes began emerging in our dynamic that I initially dismissed as normal relationship adjustment. Jake's questions about my work became more frequent and detailed, extending beyond supportive interest into territory that felt almost investigative. He wanted to know about specific client conversations, internal team dynamics, and strategic decisions that seemed beyond the scope of casual relationship sharing. When I mentioned that some information was confidential, he would respond with hurt expressions and comments about how partners should be able to share everything with each other. His freelance income became increasingly irregular, and more frequently I found myself covering expenses that had previously been shared. Rent, utilities, groceries, and entertainment costs gradually shifted to my credit cards, always with Jake's assurance that a major client payment was coming soon and he would reimburse me immediately. These promises were sometimes fulfilled, but often forgotten entirely, creating a pattern where my financial contributions became the default expectation rather than the temporary exception. More concerning were the subtle ways Jake began undermining my confidence in professional situations. When I shared excitement about a successful project presentation, he would respond with questions that highlighted potential weaknesses or oversights. When I mentioned challenges with difficult clients or team members, he would suggest that my approach might be too aggressive or that I should consider whether my communication style was creating unnecessary conflict. These comments were always framed as loving concern for my career success, but they left me second-guessing decisions and interactions that had previously felt straightforward. The most insidious aspect of this pattern was how Jake positioned himself as uniquely qualified to provide guidance on interpersonal dynamics. He frequently mentioned insights from his own therapy sessions with Dr. Amanda Richards, a workplace psychologist who specialized in professional relationships and career development. According to Jake, Dr. Richards had helped him understand patterns in his own professional interactions and had provided frameworks for analyzing relationship dynamics that could be applicable to my workplace challenges. Initially, I found Jake's therapeutic insights helpful and sophisticated. He could articulate psychological concepts like projection, transference, and boundary setting in ways that seemed relevant to my workplace experiences. When I struggled with a particularly demanding client, Jake would suggest strategies based on Dr. Richards' teachings about managing difficult personalities. When I felt frustrated with a colleague's communication style, he would offer perspectives on underlying motivations and defensive behaviors that helped me approach the situation with greater empathy. Gradually, however, these insights became tools for reframing every workplace interaction through a lens of psychological analysis that positioned me as the common denominator in any conflicts or challenge. If I had a disagreement with a team member, Jake would suggest that my defensive responses might be triggering their insecurity. If a client was dissatisfied with a design direction, he would question whether my attachment to creative control was preventing me from truly hearing their feedback. If I felt frustrated with management decisions, he would wonder whether my need for recognition was creating unrealistic expectations about being included in strategic discussion. This psychological reframing was particularly effective because it contained enough truth to be convincing while subtly undermining my trust in my own perceptions and judgments. I did sometimes get defensive when receiving feedback. I was attached to my creative work and could struggle with clients who wanted changes that compromised design integrity. I did want recognition for my contributions and could feel disappointed when my input wasn't solicited for important decisions. Jake's analysis helped me recognize these patterns while simultaneously suggesting that they represented fundamental character flaws rather than normal human responses to challenging situations. The breaking point came during a particularly stressful period at work when TechFlow was pursuing a major contract with a healthcare network that could significantly expand our business. I was leading the design team for the proposal, which meant weeks of intense collaboration with multiple departments, late nights refining prototypes and high-stakes presentations to potential clients. The project was both exhausting and exhilarating, representing exactly the kind of leadership opportunity I had been working toward throughout my career. Jake's response to this intense work period revealed the full extent of how our relationship had deteriorated. Instead of providing support during a crucial professional moment, he became increasingly critical of what he characterized as my obsession with work at the expense of our relationship. He complained that I was unavailable for conversations, that I brought stress home in ways that affected his own productivity, and that my focus on career advancement reflected deeper issues with control and validation seeking. When I tried to explain the importance of this opportunity for my long-term career goals, Jake responded with psychological analysis that reframed my professional ambition as neurotic behavior. According to insights he claimed to have gained from Dr. Richards, my drive for recognition in the workplace was compensation for childhood insecurities about worth and belonging. My dedication to excellent work was actually perfectionism that prevented me from accepting constructive feedback. My excitement about potential promotion was grandiosity that set me up for disappointment and resentment. These interpretations were delivered with the authority of therapeutic wisdom and genuine concern for my psychological well-being. Jake wasn't attacking my career goals. He was helping me understand the unhealthy motivations behind them. He wasn't minimizing my achievements. He was encouraging me to find validation from internal sources rather than external recognition. He wasn't undermining my professional relationships. He was helping me recognize patterns that might be sabotaging my long-term success. The insidious effectiveness of this approach was that it made disagreement or resistance seem like further evidence of the psychological issues he had identified. If I argued that my work ethic reflected genuine passion rather than neurotic compensation, that proved I was defensive and unable to accept insight about my own behavior. If I insisted that my professional relationships were healthy and collaborative, that demonstrated my blind spots about interpersonal dynamics. If I maintained that career advancement was a legitimate goal rather than growth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Grandiose fantasy that confirmed my attachment to external validation and inability to find internal worth. The healthcare contract proposal was ultimately successful, resulting in TechFlow's largest client acquisition in company history and significant recognition for my leadership throughout the project. Director Brooks specifically credited my design vision and project management skills during the company-wide announcement, and several colleagues mentioned that my work on the proposal had elevated their own contribution. The client feedback praised our team's creativity and attention to user experience, validation that felt like the culmination of years of professional development. Jake's response to this success was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as loving concern. He congratulated me on the achievement while immediately analyzing what he saw as my unhealthy reaction to positive feedback. According to his interpretation, my excitement about recognition from colleagues and supervisors revealed my desperate need for external validation. My satisfaction with contributing to company success demonstrated my confusion of personal worth with professional accomplishment. My enthusiasm about future opportunities showed my inability to appreciate present moments and relationships. Most damaging was his suggestion that my investment in career success was actually avoidance of deeper personal work around intimacy and vulnerability. Drawing on concepts he attributed to Dr. Richards, Jake proposed that my focus on professional achievement allowed me to avoid confronting fears about emotional connection and commitment. My independence and ambition were defense mechanisms that prevented me from fully engaging in our relationship and exploring possibilities for deeper partnership. This analysis was particularly effective because it reframed strengths I had always valued about myself as psychological limitations that needed therapeutic intervention. My self-reliance became fear of vulnerability. My professional competence became avoidance of emotional intimacy. My career ambitions became compensation for feelings of inadequacy in personal relationships. Jake positioned himself as the patient, loving partner who was willing to help me work through these issues, while I remained unconsciously resistant to the personal growth that would benefit both of us. The final catalyst for ending our relationship came when Jake suggested that I consider couples therapy with Dr. Richards to address what he characterized as our communication patterns and my resistance to emotional intimacy. He framed this suggestion as an investment in our future together, an opportunity to develop tools for navigating the conflicts that arose from my work stress and difficulty balancing professional and personal priorities. Something about this proposal crystallized my growing awareness that our entire relationship had become an extended psychological evaluation in which I was consistently found lacking. Every conversation had become an opportunity for Jake to apply therapeutic frameworks that positioned him as insightful and emotionally mature while casting me as defensive and psychologically limited. Every conflict was interpreted through concepts that validated his perspective while pathologizing mine. Every disagreement became evidence of my inability to accept feedback or engage in healthy communication. The relationship ended during a conversation that perfectly encapsulated the dynamic that had developed between us. I had expressed frustration about Jake's continued financial dependence and his pattern of promising to contribute to household expenses while consistently failing to follow through. Instead of acknowledging the legitimate practical concerns I was raising, Jake immediately reframed the discussion as evidence of my controlling tendencies and inability to approach relationship challenges with generosity and understanding. According to his analysis, my focus on financial contributions reflected deeper issues with trust and vulnerability that prevented me from embracing the interdependence that characterized healthy partnership. My frustration with broken promises demonstrated my rigid expectations and inability to accept that relationships involved give and take that couldn't be precisely calculated. My desire for equitable expense sharing revealed my transactional approach to love that prioritized scorekeeping over genuine connection. When I tried to redirect the conversation toward practical problem solving around our financial arrangements, Jake responded with concern about my defensive reactions and inability to engage with the emotional content of his feedback. He suggested that my resistance to psychological insight was exactly the kind of pattern that Dr. Richards helped her clients recognize and address. He mentioned that individual therapy might be beneficial for me, particularly with someone who specialized in workplace stress and relationship dynamics. The suggestion that I needed therapeutic intervention to address my supposedly dysfunctional responses to legitimate relationship concerns was the moment I recognized how completely our dynamic had been distorted. I wasn't resisting psychological insight. I was objecting to having every reasonable concern reframed as evidence of character flaws. I wasn't defensive about feedback. I was frustrated with having my perspectives consistently invalidated through pseudo-therapeutic analysis. I wasn't controlling or transactional. I was trying to maintain basic fairness and mutual respect in a relationship where my partner had abdicated responsibility while positioning himself as my psychological evaluator. The breakup conversation was surprisingly brief once I recognized the pattern clearly. I told Jake that our relationship had become unsustainable and that I needed him to move out within 2 weeks. His response was exactly what I expected: concern about my inability to work through relationship challenges, disappointment about my resistance to personal growth, and suggestions about therapeutic resources that might help me develop healthier approaches to conflict resolution and emotional intimacy. For the first time in months, I felt clear and confident in my response. I wasn't interested in analyzing my motivations for ending the relationship or exploring alternative approaches to our conflicts. I had made a decision based on careful observation of our patterns, and I was implementing that decision regardless of his psychological interpretation. The relationship was over, and he needed to respect that boundary without attempting to therapeutically process my choice. Jake moved out over the following weekend, taking his possessions and leaving behind only a carefully crafted email that positioned our breakup as my choice to prioritize career ambitions over relationship commitment. He expressed hope that I would eventually develop the emotional maturity to engage in healthy partnership, and he mentioned his intention to continue working with Dr. Richards on his own patterns around choosing partners who were unavailable for genuine intimacy. The relief I felt after he left was profound and immediate. My loft felt like my own space again, quiet and orderly in ways that allowed me to think clearly and relax completely. I could come home from challenging workdays without having my experiences immediately analyzed through psychological frameworks that pathologized normal professional stress. I could share excitement about career developments without having my enthusiasm reframed as neurotic attachment to external validation. I could make decisions about my time, money, and energy without having to justify them through therapeutic concepts that consistently found me lacking. For 8 months following our breakup, I rebuilt my sense of professional confidence and personal autonomy. Work at TechFlow continued to be fulfilling and challenging, with the successful healthcare contract leading to additional opportunities for leadership and creative responsibility. I was promoted to lead UX designer with expanded oversight of junior team members and inclusion in strategic planning discussions about the company's future direction. My relationship with Director Brooks deepened into genuine mentorship, with regular conversations about career development and possibilities for advancement within the organization. Personally, I rediscovered the independence and self-direction that had been gradually eroded during my relationship with Jake. I returned to rock climbing with renewed enthusiasm, joined a weekly hiking group that explored trails throughout Central Texas, and began taking pottery classes at a local studio. These activities felt restorative in ways that went beyond simple stress relief, reconnecting me with aspects of my identity that had been overshadowed by constant psychological analysis and relationship management. My social life expanded to include colleagues who became genuine friends, neighbors in my building who shared interests in local music and food, and fellow outdoor enthusiasts who appreciated adventure without requiring emotional processing of every experience. These relationships felt refreshingly straightforward, based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than psychological evaluation and therapeutic insight. Most importantly, I regained trust in my own perceptions and judgment. Without Jake's constant reframing of my experiences through psychological concepts that questioned my motivations and emotional health, I rediscovered confidence in my professional instincts and personal decisions. I could have challenging conversations with colleagues, without immediately wondering whether my communication style was triggering their defensiveness. I could feel frustrated with workplace dynamics, without questioning whether my reactions revealed character flaws that needed therapeutic intervention. The months following our breakup convinced me that I had successfully escaped a relationship dynamic that had been systematically undermining my confidence and autonomy. I felt stronger, clearer, and more professionally effective than I had in years. My career was advancing steadily, my personal life was fulfilling and authentic, and I had developed better boundaries around psychological manipulation disguised as helpful insight. I thought the hardest part was behind me. I believed that ending the relationship had also ended my exposure to the therapeutic analysis that had been so destructive to my sense of self and professional judgment. I had no way of anticipating that Dr. Amanda Rich, the woman who had spent months listening to Jake's version of our relationship, and providing the psychological frameworks he used to undermine my confidence, was about to become a central figure in my professional life with the authority to evaluate my workplace performance and career prospects. The announcement came during a routine Monday morning team meeting in TechFlow's main conference room. Director Brooks opened the session with news about organizational changes designed to enhance employee wellness and professional development. The company had decided to hire a dedicated employee relations manager who would oversee conflict resolution, performance improvement, and strategic initiatives around workplace culture and mental health support. As he described the new position, I felt genuinely excited about the prospect of having dedicated resources for professional development and workplace wellness. TechFlow had always been a supportive environment,
but the rapid growth we had experienced over the past 2 years had created new challenges around communication, team dynamics, and work-life balance. Having a specialist focused on these issues seemed like a progressive step that would benefit everyone in the organization. Director Brooks explained that the new employee relations manager would be Dr. Amanda Richards, a licensed psychologist with extensive experience in workplace dynamics and organizational psychology. She would be starting the following week and would be scheduling individual meetings with all employees to introduce herself and assess current workplace satisfaction and professional development goals. The moment he said her name, I felt the conference room shift and blur around me as if I were suddenly viewing the scene through water. Dr. Amanda Richards, Jake's therapist, the woman whose psychological insights had been used to systematically undermine my confidence for months, was going to be my supervisor for all workplace conflicts and professional development. She would have access to my performance reviews, authority over my career advancement, and the ability to influence my standing within the organization. As Director Brooks continued describing Richard's qualifications and the scope of her new role, I struggled to maintain a neutral expression while my mind raced through the implications of this development. She knew intimate details about my relationship with Jake, filtered through his perspective and psychological interpretations that painted me as defensive, controlling, and emotionally immature. She had provided the therapeutic frameworks that Jake used to pathologize my professional ambitions and reframe my reasonable concerns as character flaws. Now she would be in a position to evaluate my workplace behavior, mediate any conflicts I might have with colleagues, and make recommendations about my suitability for promotion and leadership responsibility. The woman who had indirectly participated in undermining my confidence and autonomy for months was about to become the gatekeeper for my professional future at TechFlow Solutions. The rest of the meeting passed in a haze of forced normalcy as I struggled to process the magnitude of what had just been announced. My colleagues around the conference table were nodding approvingly at Director Brooks's description of Dr. Richards' credentials and the wellness initiatives she would be implementing. Jennifer Walsh, who sat to my left, whispered that having dedicated mental health support sounded like exactly what the company needed as we continued expanding. Maya Chen, my closest friend at TechFlow, caught my eye from across the table and smiled, clearly pleased about the prospect of professional development resources. I managed to maintain an appropriately interested expression while internally calculating the devastating implications of this appointment. Dr. Richards would have access to my personnel file, including performance reviews that documented my leadership potential and career trajectory. She would be responsible for mediating any workplace conflicts, which meant that any professional disagreements or challenges would be filtered through her psychological analysis of my character and interpersonal skill. Most concerning, she would be involved in promotion decisions and career development planning, giving her direct influence over my professional future at a company where I had invested 5 years building my reputation and advancing my career. Director Brooks explained that Dr. Richards would be conducting individual assessment meetings with all employees over the next month to establish baseline measurements of workplace satisfaction, professional goals, and team dynamics. These conversations would inform her recommendations for organizational improvements and individual development plans. The meetings were described as collaborative and confidential, designed to ensure that every employee felt heard and supported in their career growth. The irony of this description was almost unbearable.
The woman who had indirectly participated in systematically undermining my confidence through therapeutic insights, shared with my manipulative ex-boyfriend, was now being positioned as my advocate for professional development and workplace wellness. The psychological framework she had provided to Jake, which he used to pathologize my ambitions and reframe my legitimate concerns as character defects, would now be applied directly to evaluating my workplace behavior and career potential. As the meeting concluded and my colleagues filed out discussing their enthusiasm for the new wellness initiatives, I remained seated, pretending to review my notes while actually trying to regulate my breathing and heart rate. The familiar sensation of being psychologically evaluated and found lacking, which I thought I had escaped 8 months ago, was already returning with nauseating intensity. Every interaction I would have with Dr. Richards would carry the weight of Jake's interpretations of our relationship, his characterizations of my defensive and controlling tendencies, and the therapeutic analysis that had gradually convinced me to doubt my own perceptions and judgment. Maya lingered after the others had left, clearly sensing that something was troubling me despite my attempts to appear professionally composed. She had been my closest colleague since joining TechFlow, and our friendship had deepened considerably during my relationship with Jake and its aftermath. Maya was one of the few people who had witnessed how that relationship had affected my confidence and work performance, and she had been consistently supportive during my recovery of professional self-assurance. "You okay?" she asked quietly, gathering her materials while watching my face with concern. "You seemed a little off during the second half of the meeting." I considered how much to reveal about my connection to Dr. Richards without compromising my professional reputation or creating gossip that might affect my standing within the company. Maya was trustworthy and discreet, but the situation was so complex and potentially damaging that I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding paranoid or unprofessional. "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice carried a tension that contradicted my words, just processing the organizational changes and thinking about how they might affect our team dynamics. Maya's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by my explanation, but she respected my privacy enough not to push for detail. "Well, if you want to talk through any concerns, you know I'm here. Change can be stressful even when it's positive." After she left, I sat alone in the empty conference room, staring out at the Austin skyline while trying to develop a strategy for navigating this impossible situation. Objecting to Dr. Richards' appointment or requesting to be excluded from her wellness initiatives would require explanations that would inevitably damage my professional reputation. Revealing my personal connection to her through Jake would open discussions about my judgment in relationships and potentially create questions about my emotional stability and professional objectivity. Conversely, participating normally in her assessment processes meant submitting to psychological evaluation by someone who already possessed a detailed and likely distorted understanding of my personality, communication style, and interpersonal pattern. Every response I gave during our individual meeting would be interpreted through the lens of Jake's characterizations of me as defensive, controlling, and resistant to therapeutic insight. Every workplace challenge or conflict I discussed would be analyzed using frameworks that had already been applied to pathologize my professional ambitions and personal boundaries. The impossibility of the situation was overwhelming. There was no way to engage authentically with Richard's wellness initiatives without providing her additional ammunition for psychological analysis that would inevitably find me lacking. There was no way to avoid her evaluation processes without appearing uncooperative and potentially damaging my reputation for professionalism and team collaboration. There was no way to reveal my concerns about bias and conflict of interest without exposing personal details that would undermine my credibility and professional standing. That afternoon, I attempted to maintain normal productivity on my current design projects, while mentally preparing for what felt like an inevitable professional disaster. The user interface I was developing for a small business inventory system, the work that typically engaged my full creative attention, felt mechanical and uninspired as I struggled to concentrate through the anxiety of anticipating psychological evaluation by someone predisposed to find me psychologically problematic. My usual end-of-day routine, reviewing project progress and preparing tomorrow's priorities, was interrupted by an email from Dr. Richards herself. The message was professionally warm and welcoming, introducing herself to the TechFlow team and expressing enthusiasm about supporting everyone's career development and workplace satisfaction. She explained that she would be scheduling individual meetings over the next few weeks, and requested that employees use an attached form to indicate their preferred times and any specific topics they hope to discuss. Reading her email felt surreal, like encountering a character from a nightmare in mundane professional correspondence. Her tone was exactly what I would have expected from Jake's descriptions: authoritative but approachable, psychologically sophisticated but accessible, genuinely concerned about employee well-being while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. She was clearly competent and well qualified for her role, which made my situation even more complicated because my concerns about bias weren't based on her professional inadequacy, but on her access to personal information that could influence her objectivity. The attached scheduling form included questions about current workplace challenges, professional development goals, and areas where additional support might be beneficial. These were reasonable requests that would help her tailor individual meetings to each employee's needs and interests. For anyone else in the company, completing this form would be a valuable opportunity to advocate for their career advancement and address workplace concerns with someone specifically hired to support employee success. For me, every question felt like a trap that would provide additional evidence for psychological interpretations that had already been established through Jake's perspective. If I mentioned challenges with demanding clients, she might interpret that as evidence of my difficulty accepting feedback and managing interpersonal conflict. If I expressed interest in leadership development, she might view that as grandiose ambitions that reflected underlying insecurity and need for external validation. If I indicated satisfaction with current workplace dynamics, she might see that as defensive avoidance of addressing interpersonal patterns that needed therapeutic intervention. I spent the remainder of the afternoon drafting and redrafting responses to her scheduling form, trying to strike a balance between professional engagement and self-protection. Every sentence required careful consideration of how it might be interpreted through psychological frameworks that positioned me as psychologically limited and interpersonally challenged. The simple act of scheduling a meeting had become an exercise in strategic communication designed to minimize opportunities for pathological analysis. By evening, I had managed to complete the form with responses that were professionally appropriate but deliberately vague. I requested a meeting time during the following week and indicated general interest in professional development opportunities without specifying particular challenges or goals that might provide material for psychological interpretation. The result was bland and uninspiring, exactly the opposite of the authentic engagement that would normally characterize my approach to career development discussion. Driving home to my downtown loft, I felt the familiar sensation of having my authentic self systematically constrained by the need to avoid psychological evaluation and judgment. The freedom and confidence I had rebuilt over 8 months of independence were already being eroded by the anticipation of therapeutic analysis that would inevitably find me lacking. My workplace, which had been a source of satisfaction and professional growth, was becoming another environment where I would need to carefully monitor my responses and behaviors to avoid confirming negative psychological assessment. That evening, I called Maya from my apartment, finally ready to share at least part of my concerns about the new employee relations manager. I couldn't reveal the full extent of my connection to Dr. Richards without discussing details about my relationship with Jake that felt too personal and potentially damaging to share. But I could express general anxiety about psychological evaluation in the workplace and seek her perspective on navigating the new dynamic. I'm feeling pretty anxious about these individual assessment meetings, I admitted after we had exchanged greetings and updates about our respective days. There's something about having a psychologist evaluating workplace performance that makes me uncomfortable. Maya was quiet for a moment, considering my concern with the thoughtfulness that characterized her approach to complex interpersonal situations. Having your work performance analyzed through a psychological lens could feel pretty invasive, especially if you're not used to that kind of framework. Her validation was reassuring, confirming that my discomfort wasn't entirely irrational or defensive. I keep wondering how objective these evaluations can really be, I continued. Psychology isn't an exact science, and there's so much room for bias and misinterpretation when someone is analyzing your personality and communication style. True, Maya agreed. Though I guess the hope is that having someone specifically focused on employee well-being will help identify and address problems before they become major issues. At least that's how I'm trying to think about it. I appreciated her balanced perspective, which acknowledged both the potential benefits and risks of psychological evaluation in the workplace. Maya had always been skilled at finding constructive angles on challenging situations, without dismissing legitimate concerns or fear. Have you thought about what you want to discuss in your meeting? She asked. Maybe approaching it strategically, like any other professional conversation, might help it feel less intimidating. This suggestion was helpful, redirecting my focus from the psychological evaluation aspects of the meeting toward the practical professional development opportunities it might provide. If I could approach the conversation as a career planning discussion rather than a therapeutic assessment, I might be able to engage more authentically while still protecting myself from psychological interpretation. That's a good point, I reply. I suppose I can treat it like any other professional development conversation and focus on concrete goals and challenges rather than getting caught up in personality analysis. After ending the call with Maya, I spent the evening researching Dr. Richard's professional background and qualifications, hoping to gain insight into her therapeutic approach and potential biases. Her LinkedIn profile documented impressive credentials, including a doctoral degree in organizational psychology from a respected university, several years of experience providing therapy for working professionals, and multiple publications on workplace mental health and employee wellness initiatives. Her professional writings, which I found through academic databases and psychology journals, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of workplace dynamics and evidence-based approaches to organizational improvement. Her therapeutic philosophy appeared to emphasize collaboration and empowerment rather than pathological analysis, focusing on building employee strengths and addressing systemic issues, rather than diagnosing individual psychological problems. This research should have been reassuring, providing evidence that Dr. Richards was a competent and ethical professional who would approach employee evaluations with appropriate objectivity and respect. Instead, it intensified my anxiety by confirming that she possessed exactly the expertise and authority needed to conduct thorough psychological assessments that would carry significant weight in professional context. Her qualifications meant that any conclusions she reached about my personality, communication style, or interpersonal patterns would be taken seriously by TechFlow leadership and could significantly influence my career prospects. Her expertise in workplace psychology meant that she would be skilled at identifying behavioral patterns and psychological dynamics that I might not even recognize in myself. Her access to Jake's perspective on our relationship meant that she already possessed a framework for interpreting my behavior that positioned me as psychologically problematic. The combination of her professional competence and her personal knowledge of my relationship history created a uniquely threatening situation. A less qualified evaluator might reach conclusions that could be easily challenged or dismissed. A more objective evaluator might assess my workplace behavior without the bias of pre-existing psychological interpretation. Richards represented the worst possible combination: a highly qualified professional with access to personal information that could influence her objectivity in ways that would be difficult to identify or address. Sleep was elusive that night as I mentally rehearsed potential conversations with Dr. Richards and tried to anticipate how she might interpret various responses. Every possible topic of discussion carried risks for psychological analysis that could damage my professional reputation. Expressing enthusiasm about career advancement might be viewed as grandiose ambitions, reflecting underlying insecurity. Acknowledging workplace challenges might be interpreted as evidence of interpersonal difficulties and defensive communication patterns. Maintaining that I was satisfied with current dynamics might be seen as resistance to self-reflection and personal growth. The following week passed with mounting tension as I awaited my scheduled appointment with Dr. Rich. My usual productivity and creative engagement with design projects were compromised by constant preoccupation with the upcoming evaluation and its potential consequences for my career. Colleagues began commenting on my distracted demeanor and asking whether I was feeling well or dealing with personal stress that was affecting my work performance. These expressions of concern, while well-intentioned, only intensified my anxiety about how my changed behavior might be interpreted during psychological evaluation. Richards had already heard from other employees that I seemed stressed or distracted. She might enter our meeting with predetermined conclusions about my emotional stability and professional competence. If she observed signs of anxiety during our conversation, she might interpret that as evidence of underlying psychological issues, rather than appropriate concern about being evaluated by someone with access to biased personal information. Director Brooks scheduled our usual monthly one-on-one meeting during this period,
and I struggled to maintain normal professional engagement while managing my anxiety about the upcoming psychological evaluation. Our conversation covered routine topics including project updates, team dynamics, and professional development goals, but I found myself second-guessing every response and wondering how similar discussions with Dr. Richards might be interpreted through psychological framework. "You seem a little more reserved than usual," Director Brooks observed near the end of our meeting. "Everything going well personally? Work-life balance, feeling manageable?" His question was routine and supportive, reflecting the kind of managerial concern that had always characterized our professional relationship. Under normal circumstances, I would have appreciated his attentiveness and responded with honest feedback about any challenges I was experiencing. But in the context of knowing that Dr. Richards would soon be evaluating my workplace behavior and emotional stability, his observation felt like evidence that my anxiety was already affecting my professional reputation. "Everything's fine," I replied, though my tone was unconvincing even to myself. "Just focused on some complex design challenges and thinking through strategic questions about user experience framework." Director Brooks accepted this explanation without further inquiry, but I could see that he remained slightly concerned about my demeanor. The interaction left me wondering whether he might mention his observations to Dr. Richards during their collaborative discussions about employee well-being and professional development. If so, she would enter our individual meeting with information suggesting that I was experiencing stress or personal challenges that were affecting my work performance. The night before my scheduled appointment with Dr. Richards, I called my parents in San Antonio, seeking the comfort and perspective that their support had always provided during challenging periods. I couldn't share the specific details of my situation without revealing information about my relationship with Jake that would worry them unnecessarily, but I could express general anxiety about workplace changes and seek their advice about navigating professional evaluation process. "Mija, you've always been such a strong worker," my mother reassured me after I had described my concerns about the new employee relations manager and individual assessment meetings. "Whatever this psychologist evaluates, she's going to see someone who is dedicated, intelligent, and professional. You have nothing to worry about." My father, who had spent decades navigating educational bureaucracy as a high school principal, offered practical advice about approaching psychological evaluation in professional context. "Remember that these assessments are supposed to help you succeed, not find problems," he said. "Be honest about your goals and challenges, but don't feel like you need to analyze yourself or provide more information than what's out." Their support was comforting and helped me gain some perspective on the situation. From their viewpoint, I was an accomplished professional who had every reason to approach workplace evaluation with confidence. They couldn't know about the psychological interpretations that Jake had shared with Dr. Richards, or the ways that therapeutic frameworks had been used to undermine my self-perception and professional confidence. The morning of my appointment arrived with crisp December air and unusually clear skies that made Austin's skyline look sharp and promising from my loft windows. I dressed carefully in professional attire that projected competence without appearing defensive or overly formal. The balance felt important, conveying appropriate respect for the meeting while avoiding any impression that I was anxious or overcompensating for concerns about the evaluation process. Arriving at TechFlow's offices, I noticed that Dr. Richards had been assigned a corner office on the 11th floor, one level below our main workspace, but with equally impressive views of the city. The location seemed strategically chosen to provide privacy for confidential conversations, while maintaining accessibility for employees seeking support or guidance. A small waiting area outside her office included comfortable seating and calming artwork that created an atmosphere more reminiscent of a therapeutic practice than a corporate environment. I arrived precisely on time for our scheduled appointment, neither early enough to appear anxious nor late enough to suggest disrespect or avoidance. The receptionist, Jennifer Walsh from our design team, who was apparently helping with scheduling coordination,
greeted me warmly and confirmed that Dr. Richards was ready for our meeting. "She's really nice," Jennifer whispered as she walked me toward the office. "Very professional but easy to talk to. I think you'll like her." The irony of this recommendation was almost overwhelming. Jennifer had no way of knowing that my concerns about Dr. Richards had nothing to do with her professional competence or interpersonal skills, but rather with her access to personal information that could compromise her objectivity in evaluating my workplace behavior and career potential. Dr. Richards opened her office door before I had a chance to knock, greeting me with a warm smile and professional handshake that immediately reminded me of Jake's descriptions of her therapeutic presence. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 40s, with shoulder-length brown hair and glasses that gave her an approachable academic appearance. Her office was tastefully decorated with diplomas, professional certifications, and artwork that created an atmosphere of calm competence. "Sarah, it's wonderful to meet you," she said, gesturing toward a comfortable seating area near the window. "I've heard such positive things about your work from Director Brooks and several of your colleagues. Thank you for taking time to meet with me." Her manner was exactly as I had anticipated, professionally warm, psychologically sophisticated, and genuinely interested in employee well-being. There was nothing overtly threatening or problematic about her approach, which made my situation even more complex because my concerns weren't based on any obvious red flags, but on knowledge she possessed that could influence her objectivity. "Thank you for making time to meet with everyone individually," I replied, settling into the chair she had indicated while trying to project appropriate professional engagement. "The commitment to employee wellness is one of the things I've always appreciated about TechFlow's culture." She nodded approvingly at this response, making a brief note on the legal pad beside her chair. The simple act of recording my comments immediately heightened my awareness that everything I said would be documented and potentially analyzed for psychological insights about my personality and interpersonal patterns. "I'd love to hear about your experience here," she began, leaning forward slightly in a posture that conveyed genuine interest and attention. "What initially drew you to TechFlow and how has your role evolved over the past 5 years?" The question was reasonable and professionally appropriate, exactly the kind of inquiry that would help her understand my career trajectory and workplace satisfaction. Under normal circumstances, I would have welcomed the opportunity to discuss my professional development and highlight achievements that demonstrated my value to the organization. But responding authentically meant providing information that could be interpreted through psychological frameworks that had already been established through Jake's perspective. If I expressed enthusiasm about my career progression, she might view that as evidence of the grandiose ambitions and need for external validation that Jake had identified as problematic patterns in my personality. If I mentioned challenges I had overcome or leadership roles I had assumed, she might interpret that as confirmation of my controlling tendencies and difficulty accepting guidance from others. I offered a carefully constructed response that highlighted my professional growth while avoiding specific examples that might provide material for psychological analysis. I described my evolution from junior to senior designer in general terms, emphasized my appreciation for TechFlow's collaborative culture, and expressed satisfaction with the opportunities for creative and strategic contribution that my current role provided. Dr. Richards listened attentively, occasionally nodding or asking follow-up questions that demonstrated her engagement with my responses. Her questions were skillfully crafted to elicit more detailed information, while maintaining the conversational tone that made psychological evaluation feel like professional development discussion. "It sounds like you found a really good fit here," she observed after I had finished describing my career progression. "What would you say are the aspects of your work that feel most fulfilling or energizing?" This question required even more careful consideration, because authentic answers would reveal information about my personality, values, and motivations that could be analyzed through therapeutic framework. If I mentioned my enjoyment of leadership opportunities, she might see that as evidence of control issues and need for authority over others. If I discussed my satisfaction with creative problem solving, she might interpret that as perfectionist tendencies and difficulty accepting alternative solutions. I provided responses that were truthful but strategically vague,
emphasizing collaborative aspects of design work and team-oriented achievements that would be difficult to pathologize through individual psychological analysis. The conversation continued in this manner for nearly an hour, with Dr. Richards asking thoughtful questions about workplace satisfaction, professional goals, and team dynamics, while I provided carefully crafted answers designed to minimize opportunities for psychological interpretation. Throughout the meeting, I found myself studying her expressions and responses for any indication that she recognized me from Jake's descriptions of our relationship. There were moments when I thought I detected a flicker of familiarity or deeper interest in my responses, but her professional demeanor made it impossible to determine whether these observations reflected actual recognition or my own paranoid hypervigilance. The meeting concluded with Dr. Richards thanking me for my openness and expressing enthusiasm about supporting my continued professional development at TechFlow. She mentioned that she would be following up with all employees over the coming months to check on progress and provide additional resources as needed. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any workplace challenges or professional development questions, she said, as we concluded our conversation. My door is always open, and I'm here to support your success in whatever way would be most helpful. Her offer was professionally appropriate and genuinely supportive, exactly what I would have expected from a competent employee relations manager. But the subtext of her invitation, filtered through my knowledge of her connection to Jake and access to his psychological interpretations of my behavior, felt more like a threat than an offer of support. Walking back to my desk after the meeting, I felt emotionally exhausted from the effort of maintaining professional composure while navigating psychological evaluation by someone predisposed to find me problematic. The conversation had been superficially positive and professionally appropriate, but I knew that everything I had said would be analyzed through frameworks that positioned me as defensive, controlling, and resistant to therapeutic insight. The remainder of the day was unproductive as I struggled to concentrate on design work while processing the anxiety and frustration of being psychologically evaluated by someone with access to biased personal information. My colleagues seemed to notice my distracted demeanor, with several people asking whether my meeting with Dr. Richards had gone well and whether I was feeling satisfied with the new wellness initiative. These expressions of concern, while well-intentioned, only intensified my awareness that my changed behavior was becoming visible to others and might be reported back to Dr. Richards as evidence of workplace stress or interpersonal difficulty. The psychological evaluation I had just endured was beginning to affect my professional performance in ways that would likely be interpreted as confirmation of the character flaws and emotional limitations that Jake had shared with his therapist. That evening, I sat in my loft trying to process the reality that my workplace had become another environment where I would need to carefully monitor my behavior to avoid confirming negative psychological assessments. The freedom and professional confidence I had rebuilt over 8 months of independence were already being eroded by the knowledge that Dr. Richards was now positioned to influence my career prospects through psychological analysis that incorporated Jake's biased perspective on my personality and interpersonal patterns.
The situation felt impossible and unsustainable, but I couldn't see any viable options for addressing it without damaging my professional reputation or revealing personal information that would undermine my credibility. I was trapped in a psychological evaluation process that was inherently biased against me, conducted by someone with the expertise and authority to make her conclusions influential in determining my professional future. The weeks following my initial assessment meeting with Dr. Richards brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the workplace atmosphere around me. What had been a supportive and collaborative environment began to feel charged with psychological scrutiny that extended far beyond normal professional evaluation. It started with seemingly innocent check-ins and expanded into a comprehensive analysis of my workplace behavior that felt increasingly invasive and pathological. Dr. Richards began appearing at team meetings where her presence hadn't been previously announced or explained. She would sit quietly in the corner, ostensibly observing general team dynamics and organizational culture, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her attention was disproportionately focused on my contributions and interactions. During project discussions, I became acutely aware of how my comments might be interpreted through psychological frameworks that positioned me as controlling or defensive. When I suggested alternative approaches to user interface challenges, I wondered whether Dr. Richards was noting my assertiveness as evidence of difficulty accepting collaborative input. When I expressed disagreement with design directions that compromised usability principles, I feared she was documenting my resistance to feedback as confirmation of rigid thinking pattern. Every professional interaction became a performance where I was simultaneously trying to contribute effectively to projects while avoiding behaviors that might be pathologized through therapeutic analysis. The most unsettling aspect of these team meeting observations was Dr. Richards' practice of scheduling follow-up conversations with individual team members to discuss what she characterized as professional development opportunities that had emerged from her observation. These meetings were framed as supportive interventions designed to help employees recognize and address interpersonal patterns that might be limiting their career advancement. Jennifer Walsh was the first colleague to mention her follow-up conversation with Richards, describing it as surprisingly insightful and helpful for understanding communication dynamics within our design team. According to Jennifer, Dr. Richards had observed that she tended to defer to more assertive team members during brainstorming sessions, potentially limiting her creative contributions and professional visibility. The feedback had encouraged Jennifer to speak up more frequently and advocate for her design ideas with greater confidence. This example of constructive intervention should have been reassuring, demonstrating that Dr. Richards was capable of providing valuable professional development insights that enhanced rather than undermined employee performance. Instead, it intensified my anxiety about what observations she might be documenting about my own behavior and how those insights would be framed when we had our inevitable follow-up conversation. Maya shared her experience with Dr. Richards during one of our regular coffee meetings at Blue Bottle on South Lamar, describing a conversation that had helped her recognize patterns in her approach to conflict resolution that were affecting her leadership potential. Richards had observed that Maya's desire to maintain team harmony sometimes prevented her from addressing performance issues directly, a tendency that could limit her effectiveness in supervisory roles. She was really thoughtful about it, Maya explained, stirring her latte while reflecting on the conversation. Not judgmental at all, just helping me see how avoiding difficult conversations might actually be hurting the people I'm trying to protect. I listened to Maya's positive experience while internally calculating how different psychological frameworks might be applied to my own workplace behavior. If Dr. Richards viewed Maya's conflict avoidance as a limitation that needed addressing, how might she interpret my willingness to engage in professional disagreements? Would my direct communication style be framed as healthy assertiveness or aggressive behavior that undermined team collaboration? The uncertainty was maddening because it prevented me from engaging authentically in workplace interactions while simultaneously making my guarded behavior potentially suspicious to colleagues and supervisors. I found myself oscillating between forced agreeability that felt inauthentic and natural assertiveness that might be pathologized through psychological analysis. This professional paralysis began affecting my design work in tangible ways that concerned me deeply. Projects that would normally engage my full creative attention felt mechanical and uninspired as I struggled to concentrate through the anxiety of constant psychological evaluation. Client presentations that had previously been energizing opportunities to showcase innovative solutions became exercises in carefully managed self-presentation designed to avoid behaviors that might be interpreted as arrogant or controlling. The decline in my creative output didn't go unnoticed by Director Brooks, who scheduled an unplanned one-on-one meeting to discuss what he characterized as a recent change in my professional engagement and creative contribution. His concern was genuine and supportive, reflecting the mentorship relationship we had developed over years of collaborative work, but his observations created additional anxiety about how my changed behavior might be documented and analyzed. "I've noticed you seem less engaged during client presentations lately," he said, reviewing notes from recent project meetings. "Your design work is still excellent, but you're not advocating for your ideas with the same passion and conviction that used to be one of your greatest strengths." His feedback was accurate and professionally delivered, exactly the kind of constructive criticism that had always helped me improve my performance and advance my career. Under normal circumstances, I would have appreciated his attentiveness and worked collaboratively to address whatever factors were affecting my professional engagement. But in the context of knowing that Dr. Richards was evaluating my workplace behavior and might interpret any discussion of performance challenges as evidence of underlying psychological issues. I felt trapped between acknowledging legitimate concerns and protecting myself from further therapeutic analysis. I've been focusing on being more collaborative in my approach to presentations, I replied, attempting to reframe my decreased assertiveness as intentional professional development rather than anxiety-driven self-censorship. Sometimes I think my enthusiasm can come across as too dominating, so I'm trying to create more space for client input and team contribution. Director Brooks looked puzzled by this explanation, clearly recognizing that my previous approach to client presentations had been appropriately balanced between advocacy and collaboration. I've never seen your enthusiasm as dominating, he said. Your passion for user experience and design excellence is exactly what clients value about working with our team. His confusion was understandable because my explanation didn't align with his observations of my professional strengths and contributions over 5 years of working together. But I couldn't provide a more accurate account of the factors affecting my behavior without revealing my concerns about psychological evaluation by someone with access to biased personal information. The conversation concluded with Director Brooks expressing continued confidence in my capabilities, while encouraging me to regain the assertive leadership style that had contributed to my career advancement. His feedback was supportive and constructive, but I left the meeting knowing that our discussion would likely be shared with Dr. Richards as part of the collaborative approach to employee development that had been established with her appointment. My fears about this information sharing were confirmed 2 days later when I received an email from Dr. Richards requesting a follow-up meeting to discuss professional development opportunities that had emerged from her ongoing observations and conversations with team leadership. The message was professionally warm and supportive, framed as an opportunity for collaborative problem-solving around workplace challenges, rather than a psychological evaluation of my performance issue. Reading her email, I felt the familiar sensation of being maneuvered into therapeutic analysis that would inevitably position me as psychologically problematic. The language she used mirrored exactly the frameworks that Jake had employed to reframe legitimate concerns as evidence of character defects requiring professional intervention. Her offer to help me optimize my professional potential and address patterns that might be limiting career advancement carried the same paternalistic undertones that had characterized Jake's attempts to fix psychological issues he claimed to identify in my behavior. I scheduled the requested meeting while mentally preparing for what I anticipated would be a more direct psychological evaluation than our initial assessment conversation. This time, doctors would have specific behavioral observations to discuss, feedback from Director Brooks about changes in my performance, and several weeks of additional data about my workplace interactions to analyze through therapeutic framework. The preparation process felt like studying for an examination where the criteria for success were deliberately obscured and potentially rigged against me. I couldn't predict which aspects of my workplace behavior had been flagged as problematic, how my professional challenges were being interpreted through psychological analysis, or what interventions Dr. Richards might recommend to address patterns she claimed to have identified. The night before our scheduled meeting, I lay awake mentally rehearsing potential conversations and trying to anticipate how various responses might be interpreted through frameworks that positioned me as defensive and resistant to professional development. If I acknowledged feeling stressed about workplace dynamics, that might be viewed as evidence of poor emotional regulation and inability to handle professional challenge. If I maintained that I was satisfied with my performance and workplace relationships, that might be interpreted as denial and lack of self-awareness about interpersonal patterns. The impossibility of navigating these psychological interpretations successfully was becoming increasingly clear, but I couldn't see any alternative to participating in the evaluation process without appearing uncooperative and potentially damaging my reputation for professionalism and team collaboration. The morning of our follow-up meeting arrived with the kind of gray December weather that made Austin feel uncharacteristically dreary and oppressive. I arrived at Dr. Richards' office precisely on time, neither early enough to suggest anxiety, nor late enough to appear disrespectful or avoidant. Her waiting area felt more clinical than I remembered from our first meeting, perhaps because I was now approaching the space with greater awareness of its function as a site for psychological evaluation, rather than supportive professional development. Richards greeted me with the same warm professionalism that had characterized our initial conversation, but I thought I detected a subtle shift in her demeanor that suggested she was preparing to address more challenging topics than general workplace satisfaction and career goals. Her office arrangement had been modified slightly, with additional notebooks and assessment materials visible on her desk, creating an atmosphere that felt more formally evaluative. "Thank you for making time to meet again," she said, settling into her chair with a legal pad and pen positioned for note-taking. "I've had some interesting conversations with your colleagues and Director Brooks over the past few weeks, and I'm hoping we can explore some patterns that might be affecting your professional satisfaction and career trajectory." Her opening statement immediately confirmed my fears about the purpose and tone of this meeting. Rather than asking open-ended questions about my own perceptions of workplace challenges or professional development goals, she was beginning with predetermined conclusions about patterns she claimed to have identified through her observations and conversations with others. "I'd be interested to hear your perspective," I replied carefully, trying to project appropriate engagement while avoiding responses that might provide additional material for psychological analysis. She consulted her notes briefly before continuing. "Director Brooks mentioned that he's noticed some changes in your professional engagement over the past month, particularly in client presentations and team meetings. He described you as seeming less confident and assertive than usual, which is concerning given that those qualities have been significant strengths throughout your career here." The clinical way she presented this information, as if my changed behavior were symptoms of an underlying psychological condition, rather than reasonable responses to being constantly evaluated and analyzed, immediately triggered my defensive instinct. But I recognized that expressing frustration or objecting to her characterization would likely be interpreted as evidence of the defensive patterns that Jake had probably described in detail during their therapeutic session. "I've been working on being more collaborative in my approach to presentations and team discussions," I said, repeating the explanation I had provided to Director Brooks while knowing it would be equally unconvincing to someone trained in psychological analysis. "Sometimes I worry that my enthusiasm might overshadow other people's contributions." Dr. Richards made a note on her pad before responding with a slight smile that suggested she found my explanation inadequate or revealing in ways I might not recognize. "That's an interesting self-assessment," she said. "Can you help me understand what led to this concern about your enthusiasm being problematic? Have you received feedback suggesting that your previous approach was too dominating or aggressive?" Her questions were skillfully designed to elicit information about my self-perception and the internal processes that had led to changes in my behavior. If I acknowledged that no one had actually complained about my assertiveness, she might interpret my concerns as evidence of anxiety or insecurity that needed therapeutic intervention. If I suggested that my previous behavior had been problematic, she might use that admission to explore psychological patterns that supposedly needed addressing. "Not specific feedback," I replied, attempting to navigate between these interpretive tracks. "More just general awareness that effective collaboration requires balancing advocacy for your ideas with openness to other perspectives." She nodded as if this response confirmed something she had suspected, making additional notes that I couldn't see but that clearly related to psychological frameworks for understanding my behavior. "It's interesting that you're focusing on collaboration and openness to other perspectives," she observed. "In my conversations with your colleagues, several people mentioned that they actually value your willingness to advocate for design principles and push back against directions that might compromise user experience. This feedback should have been reassuring, confirming that my professional approach was valued and effective within the team. Instead, it felt like evidence that Dr. Richards was building a case for psychological intervention by establishing that my changed behavior represented a departure from successful patterns rather than appropriate professional development. "That's helpful to know," I said, though my response felt wooden and inauthentic even to myself. "I'm curious about what might be driving this shift toward what you describe as more collaborative behavior," she continued, leaning forward slightly in a posture that suggested she was preparing to explore deeper psychological territory. Sometimes when people change successful interpersonal patterns, it reflects underlying anxiety or self-doubt that might benefit from professional support. Her suggestion that my changed behavior indicated psychological problems requiring therapeutic intervention was exactly what I had anticipated and feared. The frameworks she was applying positioned any deviation from previous patterns as evidence of underlying issues, rather than reasonable responses to being constantly evaluated by someone with access to biased personal information. I think it's just natural professional development, I replied, though my tone carried a tension that contradicted my words. As you gain experience, you become more aware of different approaches to leadership and collaboration. Richards made another note before shifting to what felt like more direct psychological territory. I've been thinking about our conversation from a few weeks ago, and I'm wondering whether you might be experiencing some stress or anxiety that's affecting your workplace satisfaction and performance. Her transition to explicit discussion of stress and anxiety felt like a significant escalation in the psychological evaluation process. Rather than continuing to frame our conversation as professional development discussion, she was now directly suggesting that I was experiencing mental health challenges that required therapeutic intervention. I think everyone experiences some level of workplace stress, I said, attempting to normalize whatever observations had led to her conclusion, while avoiding admissions that might be pathologized through therapeutic analysis. Of course, she agreed, but I'm noticing some specific patterns that suggest you might be experiencing more significant anxiety than you're acknowledging. Your guarded responses during our conversations, the changes in your professional engagement that Director Brooks has observed, and what several colleagues have described as increased tension in your demeanor, all point to stress that might benefit from additional support. The systematic way she presented this evidence of my supposed psychological problems was both impressive and terrifying. She had compiled observations from multiple sources to build a comprehensive case for therapeutic intervention, using professional language and psychological frameworks that would be difficult to challenge without appearing defensive or lacking in self-awareness. More disturbing was the realization that her analysis was simultaneously accurate and completely misinterpreted. I was experiencing significant stress and anxiety, my professional engagement had changed, and I was probably exhibiting increased tension in my workplace interaction. But these symptoms weren't evidence of underlying psychological problems requiring therapeutic intervention. They were reasonable responses to being constantly evaluated by someone predisposed to find me psychologically problematic. I appreciate your concern, I said, struggling to maintain professional composure while internally raging at the impossible situation she had created. I think I'm managing workplace challenges appropriately, but I'm open to suggestions if you have recommendations for stress management or professional development resources. My attempt to redirect the conversation toward concrete support rather than psychological analysis was met with the kind of knowing smile that suggested Dr. Richards interpreted my deflection as evidence of the defensive patterns she was trying to address. I think it might be helpful for us to schedule regular check-in meetings over the next few months, she said, making a note that felt like a prescription for ongoing therapeutic intervention. Sometimes workplace stress can build gradually in ways that affect performance and job satisfaction, and having consistent support can help identify and address issues before they become more problematic. Her recommendation for regular meetings was framed as employee support, but it felt more like mandatory therapy sessions that would provide ongoing opportunities for psychological evaluation and analysis. The prospect of submitting to monthly or bi-weekly conversations where my workplace behavior would be continuously scrutinized through therapeutic frameworks was overwhelming and unsustainable. That's thoughtful of you to offer, I replied, though my voice carried reluctance that I couldn't entirely suppress. I'll think about what kind of support might be most helpful and let you know. The meeting concluded with Dr. Richards providing me with information about employee assistance programs, stress management resources, and therapeutic services available through TechFlow's benefits packet. Her recommendations were professionally appropriate and would have been genuinely helpful for someone experiencing workplace stress that wasn't directly caused by her psychological evaluation and analysis. Walking back to my desk after the meeting,
I felt emotionally and mentally exhausted from the effort of navigating therapeutic frameworks designed to pathologize my responses to being constantly evaluated. The conversation had been professionally conducted and ostensibly supportive, but every exchange had reinforced my awareness that Dr. Richards viewed me through psychological lenses that positioned me as anxious, defensive, and in need of therapeutic intervention. The remainder of the day was unproductive as I struggled to concentrate on design work while processing the implications of what had essentially been a diagnosis of workplace anxiety and recommendation for ongoing therapeutic support. My colleagues seemed to notice my distracted demeanor, with several people asking whether I was feeling well or dealing with personal challenges that were affecting my work performance. These expressions of concern, while well-intentioned, only confirmed that my stress about psychological evaluation was now visible to others and would likely be reported back to Dr. Richards as additional evidence of the mental health challenges she claimed to have identified. The therapeutic intervention she had recommended was already affecting my professional reputation in ways that would probably be interpreted as validation of her psychological assessment. That evening, I sat in my loft feeling trapped in a professional situation that was systematically undermining my confidence, performance, and career prospects through psychological analysis that incorporated biased personal information. Richards had established a framework for ongoing evaluation that positioned any resistance or objection as evidence of defensive patterns requiring therapeutic intervention, while any compliance or cooperation provided additional material for psychological analysis. The impossibility of the situation was becoming undeniable, but I still couldn't see any viable options for addressing it without damaging my professional reputation or revealing personal information that would undermine my credibility within the organization. I was being analyzed into a corner where every response confirmed psychological interpretations that positioned me as problematic and in need of professional help. 3 days after my follow-up meeting with Dr. Richards, the situation escalated in ways that confirmed my fears about how psychological evaluation could be weaponized to damage professional reputations and career prospects. I arrived at work to find an email from Director Brooks requesting an urgent meeting to discuss what he characterized as performance concerns that had been brought to his attention through the employee wellness program. The message was formal and concerning, representing a significant departure from the collegial and supportive tone that had always characterized our professional relationship. The reference to the employee wellness program left no doubt that Dr. Richards had shared her psychological assessment of my workplace behavior with leadership, framing my stress and changed performance as evidence of problems requiring managerial intervention. I spent the morning attempting to maintain normal productivity while mentally preparing for what felt like a disciplinary meeting that would be based on psychological interpretations of my behavior rather than objective assessment of my work quality or professional contribution. The user interface project I was developing for a small business client, work that typically engaged my full attention and creativity, felt impossible to focus on as I anticipated having to defend my mental health and professional competence. Director Brooks's office felt different when I arrived for our scheduled meeting, with additional documentation visible on his desk and a more formal seating arrangement that suggested he was preparing to address serious performance issues rather than engage in collaborative problem solving. His demeanor was professional but noticeably less warm than usual, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a human resources investigation than mentorship discussion. "Thank you for making time to meet," he began, consulting notes that appeared to have been prepared in advance rather than representing spontaneous concerns about my performance. Richards has shared some observations about workplace stress and performance challenges that she believes may be affecting your ability to contribute effectively to our team. The clinical way he presented this information, clearly drawing from Dr. Richard's psychological assessment rather than his own observations of my work, immediately confirmed that therapeutic frameworks were now being used to evaluate my professional competence and career prospects. Her analysis of my workplace behavior had been translated into managerial concerns that could affect my standing within the organization. "I'm surprised to hear that," I replied, though my voice carried the tension of someone who had been anticipating exactly this development. I believe my work quality and professional contributions have remained consistent despite some increased stress around organizational changes. Director Brooks referred to his notes before responding, clearly following talking points that had been provided by Dr. Richards rather than expressing his own independent assessment of my performance. The concern isn't necessarily about the quality of your work output, but rather about behavioral patterns that might be affecting team dynamics and your own job satisfaction. His reference to behavioral patterns rather than concrete performance metrics revealed that this meeting was fundamentally about psychological evaluation rather than professional assessment. Richards had successfully reframed workplace stress and changed behavior as evidence of underlying problems that required managerial intervention, using therapeutic authority to influence personnel decisions. Can you be more specific about which behavioral patterns are concerning? I asked, attempting to gather concrete information that might allow me to address specific issues rather than respond to vague psychological interpretation. Director Brooks looked uncomfortable with this request, clearly recognizing that the concerns he was raising were based on therapeutic analysis rather than his own professional observation.
Dr. Richards has observed increased anxiety and defensive responses during workplace interactions, along with what she describes as resistance to professional development feedback that might indicate underlying stress affecting your ability to collaborate effectively. The way he presented this information, as if psychological observations carried the same weight as objective performance metrics, demonstrated how thoroughly Dr. Richards had established her authority to evaluate employee competence through therapeutic frameworks. Her assessment of my behavior had been accepted as legitimate grounds for managerial concern about my professional effectiveness. I understand that organizational changes can create stress, I said, attempting to normalize my responses while avoiding admissions that might be further pathologized. I'm committed to maintaining professional effectiveness and would welcome specific feedback about areas where my contributions could be improved. My attempt to redirect the conversation toward concrete performance issues, rather than psychological analysis, was met with the kind of patient expression that suggested Director Brooks had been prepared for defensive responses that would confirm Dr. Richards' assessment of my behavioral patterns. The specific recommendation from Dr. Richards is that you participate in the Employee Assistance Program to address workplace stress and develop better strategies for managing professional challenges, he said, referring to his notes rather than making direct eye contact. This would be voluntary, but she believes it would be beneficial for both your individual success and your ability to contribute positively to team dynamic. The recommendation for mandatory therapeutic intervention disguised as voluntary employee assistance was exactly what I had feared when Dr. Richards first suggested ongoing support meetings. Her psychological assessment had been translated into managerial pressure to accept professional help for problems she claimed to have identified through therapeutic analysis of my workplace behavior. I appreciate the concern about employee wellness, I replied, struggling to maintain professional composure while recognizing that any resistance would likely be interpreted as evidence of the defensive patterns she had documented. I'd like some time to consider what type of support might be most beneficial. Director Brooks made a note before concluding the meeting with what felt like a veiled warning about the consequences of not addressing the psychological issues that Dr. Richards had identified. Of course, take whatever time you need to think it through. But I want to emphasize that we're committed to supporting employee success, and sometimes that requires acknowledging when additional resources might be helpful. His implication was clear: refusing therapeutic intervention would be viewed as failure to address performance issues that had been legitimized through Dr. Richards' psychological assessment. The Employee Assistance Program had been transformed from voluntary support into implicit requirement for maintaining professional standing within the organization. Walking back to my desk after the meeting, I felt the full weight of how completely my workplace had been compromised by psychological evaluation that positioned me as mentally unstable and professionally problematic. Richards had successfully weaponized therapeutic frameworks to create a narrative of psychological issues requiring intervention, using her professional authority to influence managerial decisions about my career prospects. The remainder of the day was consumed by anxiety about the long-term implications of this development for my professional future at TechFlow. If I refused the recommended therapeutic intervention, I would be viewed as uncooperative and resistant to addressing performance issues that had been legitimized through psychological assessment. If I participated in the employee assistance program, I would be validating Dr. Richard's characterization of me as mentally unstable and confirming that therapeutic intervention was necessary for my professional effectiveness. The impossible choice between compliance and resistance was exactly the kind of psychological trap that Jake had used to manipulate my behavior throughout our relationship, and I was horrified to discover that the same dynamics were now being deployed in my professional environment with potentially devastating consequences for my career and financial security. The weekend following Director Brooks' recommendation for therapeutic intervention felt like the calm before a storm that would determine the trajectory of my entire career. I spent Saturday morning hiking the Barton Creek Greenbelt, seeking clarity in the physical challenge and natural beauty that had always helped me process difficult decisions. The familiar rhythm of walking across limestone outcroppings and through cedar groves provided the mental space I needed to fully comprehend the magnitude of the psychological warfare being waged against my professional life. As I sat beside a quiet pool where the creek had carved a deep basin in the rock, I finally allowed myself to acknowledge the full scope of what Dr. Richards had accomplished in just over a month. She had systematically documented my workplace behavior through a lens that pathologized normal responses to stress, collaborated with management to reframe performance concerns as mental health issues, and created institutional pressure for me to accept therapeutic intervention that would validate her psychological assessment. Most insidiously, she had constructed this entire framework while maintaining plausible deniability about any personal bias or conflict of interest. The sophistication of her approach was both terrifying and impressive. Unlike Jake's direct psychological manipulation, which had eventually become obvious enough to recognize and resist, Dr. Richards had embedded her analysis within legitimate organizational structures and professional protocol. Her recommendations appeared to follow established best practices for employee wellness and performance management, making it nearly impossible to challenge her methods without appearing paranoid or unprofessional. But sitting by the creek, surrounded by the timeless geology of Central Texas, I experienced a moment of crystalline clarity about the fundamental choice I was facing. I could continue attempting to navigate the psychological evaluation process, accepting therapeutic intervention, and hoping to eventually prove my mental stability and professional competence to someone predisposed to find me problematic. Or I could recognize that the entire framework was inherently rigged against me and take decisive action to protect my career and personal integrity, regardless of the immediate consequences. The realization that I had been trapped in the same psychological manipulation dynamics that had characterized my relationship with Jake, just deployed in a professional context with institutional authority, was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant that escaping one toxic situation had not protected me from similar psychological warfare in other areas of my life. Liberating because recognizing the pattern clearly made it possible to respond strategically rather than reactively. I spent the remainder of the weekend researching employment law, organizational psychology ethics, and professional licensing standards that might provide frameworks for addressing conflicts of interest and bias in workplace mental health services. What I discovered was both encouraging and sobering. Professional licensing boards for psychologists had clear ethical guidelines about dual relationships and conflicts of interest that could potentially apply to Dr. Richards' situation. Employment law provided some protections against discrimination based on mental health status and requirements that workplace accommodations be based on legitimate business needs, rather than psychological speculation. However, pursuing formal complaints or legal challenges would require documenting the specific ways that Dr. Richards' personal knowledge of my relationship with Jake had influenced her professional assessment, which would involve revealing private information that could damage my reputation and credibility. The evidentiary standards for proving bias or discrimination were high, and the process would likely be lengthy, expensive, and potentially career-damaging regardless of the outcome. More importantly, I realized that my primary goal wasn't to punish Richards or seek legal remediation, but simply to protect my career and personal autonomy from further psychological manipulation. The most effective strategy might be to address the situation directly and professionally, creating clear boundaries around therapeutic evaluation while demonstrating my continued competence and value to the organization. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp January air that made Austin feel energetic and full of possibility. I dressed carefully in professional attire that projected confidence and competence, and I arrived at TechFlow earlier than usual to prepare for what I anticipated would be a challenging but necessary conversation with Director Brooks. My goal was to address the performance concerns he had raised while establishing clear boundaries around psychological evaluation and therapeutic intervention. I had prepared extensively for this conversation, developing a strategic approach that acknowledged legitimate workplace stress, while questioning the appropriateness of therapeutic analysis as a solution to what were fundamentally professional challenges. My research over the weekend had provided me with language and frameworks for discussing the limitations of psychological evaluation in workplace contexts without appearing defensive or resistant to legitimate feedback. Director Brooks agreed to meet with me during his usual morning office hours, and I could see from his expression that he was expecting either compliance with Dr. Richards' recommendations or defensive explanations about why therapeutic intervention wasn't necessary. What he wasn't prepared for was a thoughtful, strategic conversation about the appropriate boundaries between professional performance management and psychological analysis. "I've been thinking carefully about our conversation last week," I began, settling into the chair across from his desk with materials I had prepared to support my points. "I want to address the performance concerns you raised, but I also have some questions about the methodology being used to evaluate my workplace behavior." His expression shifted slightly, clearly recognizing that I was approaching the conversation differently than he had anticipated. "I'm listening," he said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of neutral attention that suggested he was prepared for various possible directions this discussion might take. "I appreciate the concern about workplace stress and its potential impact on team dynamics," I continued, referring to notes I had prepared to ensure I covered all the key points I wanted to make. "Stress is certainly a factor that can affect performance, and I'm committed to addressing any specific behaviors or patterns that are limiting my effectiveness." Director Brooks nodded, clearly expecting this acknowledgement to lead toward acceptance of the therapeutic intervention that Dr. Richards had recommended. Instead, I transitioned into territory that I suspected he hadn't anticipated. "However, I'm concerned about the appropriateness of using psychological analysis to evaluate workplace performance issues that might be better addressed through traditional professional development approaches," I said, maintaining a tone that was respectful but firm. "Psychological evaluation introduces subjective interpretations that may not be relevant to assessing professional competence or job performance." The slight shift in his posture indicated that this conversation was moving into territory he hadn't expected or prepared for. Dr. Richards had likely briefed him on potential defensive responses I might exhibit, but she probably hadn't anticipated that I would question the fundamental appropriateness of therapeutic frameworks in professional evaluation contexts. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by that?" he asked, clearly trying to understand my perspective while also evaluating whether my response represented the kind of resistance to feedback that Dr. Richards had warned him about. I consulted my notes briefly before continuing, wanting to present my concerns in a way that appeared thoughtful and well-researched rather than reactionary or paranoid. "Psychological assessment in workplace contexts raises questions about professional boundaries, potential bias, and the relevance of therapeutic frameworks to job performance evaluation. There's a significant difference between observable workplace behaviors that affect productivity or team collaboration and psychological interpretations of underlying motivations or mental health status." Director Brooks was quiet for a moment, clearly processing this perspective and perhaps recognizing some validity in the distinctions I was drawing. "That's an interesting point," he said finally. "How would you prefer to address the performance concerns we've discussed?" His willingness to engage with my perspective rather than immediately dismissing it as defensive resistance was encouraging and suggested that he retained some independence from Dr. Richard's psychological framework. This created an opportunity for me to propose alternative approaches that would address legitimate workplace challenges without submitting to therapeutic evaluation. I'd welcome specific feedback about behaviors or patterns that are affecting my professional effectiveness, I replied, pulling out a document I had prepared over the weekend. I've done some self-assessment of my recent performance and identified several areas where I could improve my contributions to team projects and client relationships. The document I shared with him outlined concrete strategies for enhancing my workplace engagement, improving communication during team meetings, and managing stress in ways that wouldn't affect my professional interaction. It demonstrated proactive thinking about performance improvement while avoiding the psychological frameworks that Dr. Richards had tried to impose on the situation. Director Brooks reviewed my self-assessment with interest, clearly appreciating the specificity and professional focus of my recommendations. "This is exactly the kind of constructive approach I was hoping we could develop," he said, making notes about several of my suggestions. "These seem like practical strategies that could address the concerns we've discussed." The positive response to my alternative framework was both relieving and validating, confirming that the performance issues Dr. Richards had pathologized could be addressed through traditional professional development approaches, rather than therapeutic intervention. More importantly, it demonstrated that Director Brooks was capable of evaluating my workplace behavior independently from the psychological interpretations that had been provided to him. "I'm committed to implementing these strategies immediately," I said, referring to the timeline I had included in my self-assessment document. "I'd appreciate feedback in a few weeks about whether you're seeing improvement in the areas we've identified." This request for concrete performance evaluation created accountability while establishing that my professional effectiveness should be measured through observable workplace behaviors rather than psychological speculation about my mental health or underlying motivation. Director Brooks agreed to this approach with apparent relief, perhaps recognizing that traditional performance management was more straightforward and appropriate than attempting to coordinate therapeutic intervention with employee development. We scheduled a follow-up meeting for 3 weeks later to assess progress and discuss any additional strategies that might be beneficial. The conversation concluded with a renewed sense of collaborative problem-solving that reminded me why I had always valued my professional relationship with Director Brooks. By reframing the situation as a performance development opportunity rather than a mental health issue, we had established a path forward that respected my autonomy while addressing legitimate workplace concerns. However, I knew that this conversation with Director Brooks was only the first step in protecting myself from Dr. Richards' psychological manipulation. She would likely view my successful resistance to therapeutic intervention as confirmation of the defensive patterns she claimed to have identified, and she would probably intensify her efforts to document workplace behaviors that supported her psychological assessment. My prediction proved accurate when I received an email from Dr. Richards later that afternoon, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss what she characterized as concerning developments in my response to professional development feedback. The message was professionally worded, but carried an undertone of psychological analysis that suggested she interpreted my conversation with Director Brooks as evidence of resistance to therapeutic insight, rather than legitimate preference for traditional performance management. I scheduled the requested meeting while mentally preparing for what I anticipated would be a more direct confrontation about my refusal to accept her psychological frameworks and therapeutic recommendations. This conversation would likely determine whether I could successfully establish boundaries around psychological evaluation, or whether her institutional authority would ultimately prevail in forcing therapeutic intervention. The meeting took place 2 days later in Richard's office, which felt more clinical and evaluative than ever before. She had clearly prepared extensively for this conversation, with multiple notebooks and assessment materials visible on her desk, creating an atmosphere that suggested she was documenting evidence for formal psychological evaluation, rather than engaging in collaborative professional development discussion. "Thank you for making time to meet," she began, her tone carrying a formality that indicated she was approaching this conversation as a therapeutic intervention, rather than a workplace discussion. "I understand you had a conversation with Director Brooks about alternative approaches to addressing workplace stress and performance concerns.
Her framing of my conversation with Director Brooks as resistance to addressing legitimate problems immediately established the psychological framework she intended to apply to our discussion. By characterizing my preference for traditional performance management as avoidance of necessary therapeutic intervention, she was positioning any objections I might raise as evidence of the defensive patterns she claimed to have identified. Yes, we had a productive conversation about specific strategies for improving my workplace engagement, I replied, maintaining a professional tone while refusing to accept her characterization of the situation as resistance to necessary help. She made a note on her pad before continuing with what felt like a prepared analysis of my behavior and its psychological implications. I'm concerned that your reluctance to engage with employee assistance resources might be preventing you from addressing underlying stress and anxiety that could continue to affect your professional performance. Her direct statement that my refusal to accept therapeutic intervention represented a psychological problem requiring professional attention was exactly the kind of authoritative analysis that Jake had used to manipulate my behavior throughout our relationship. The same frameworks that had been deployed to pathologize my personal boundaries were now being applied to pathologize my professional autonomy. I appreciate your concern about employee wellness, I said, drawing on the strategic approach I had developed over the weekend. However, I believe that workplace stress is most effectively addressed through professional development and performance management, rather than therapeutic intervention. My clear articulation of boundaries around psychological evaluation was met with the kind of knowing expression that suggested Dr. Richards interpreted my resistance as confirmation of the psychological issues she was trying to address. But I had anticipated this response and prepared for the escalation that would likely follow. I think it's important for us to discuss the pattern I've observed in your responses to professional development feedback, she said, consulting her notes in a way that suggested she was building a formal case for therapeutic intervention. Your resistance to psychological insight and preference for what you characterize as traditional approaches may actually be limiting your ability to recognize and address interpersonal patterns that are affecting your workplace relationship. The sophisticated way she reframed my legitimate preferences as evidence of psychological limitation was both impressive and terrifying. She was using therapeutic authority to pathologize any resistance to her frameworks, creating a situation where disagreement with her analysis became additional evidence supporting her psychological assessment. But I had spent the weekend preparing for exactly this dynamic, and I was ready to respond in ways that challenged her authority rather than accepting her psychological interpretation. I understand that you view workplace challenges through a therapeutic lens, I said, maintaining eye contact and projecting confidence despite the intimidating nature of being psychologically evaluated by a licensed professional. However, I don't believe that psychological analysis is appropriate or necessary for addressing professional performance issues. My direct challenge to the appropriateness of her therapeutic frameworks clearly caught her off guard, as she had probably expected, either defensive justifications of my behavior or reluctant acceptance of her psychological authority. Instead, I was questioning the fundamental premises of her approach and asserting my right to refuse psychological evaluation in professional contexts. That's an interesting perspective, she replied, though her tone suggested she found my position problematic rather than reasonable. Can you help me understand why you believe that psychological insight wouldn't be beneficial for addressing workplace stress and interpersonal challenge? Her question was designed to elicit responses that would provide additional material for psychological analysis, but I had anticipated this tactic and prepared responses that focused on professional appropriateness rather than personal resistance to therapeutic intervention. Psychological evaluation introduces subjective interpretations that may not be relevant to job performance, I said, referring to research I had conducted over the weekend. Professional competence should be measured through observable workplace behaviors and outcomes, rather than speculation about underlying psychological motivations or mental health status. The clear, articulate way I presented this position seemed to surprise her, as she had likely expected emotional responses that could be analyzed through therapeutic frameworks, rather than rational arguments about professional boundaries and evaluation methods. I see, she said, making extensive notes about what I assumed were her psychological interpretations of my resistance to her authority. I think it might be helpful for us to explore why you're experiencing such strong reactions to employee support resources that are designed to enhance professional success. Her attempt to reframe my clear articulation of boundaries as evidence of psychological problems requiring therapeutic exploration was exactly the kind of manipulation I had anticipated and prepared to resist. Instead of defending my mental health or providing explanations that could be psychologically analyzed, I maintained focus on professional appropriateness and institutional boundaries. I don't believe I'm experiencing inappropriate reactions, I replied calmly.
I'm expressing a professional preference for traditional performance management approaches over psychological evaluation, which is a reasonable position that doesn't require therapeutic exploration. The conversation continued in this manner for nearly an hour, with Dr. Richards attempting to pathologize my resistance to her frameworks, while I maintained clear boundaries around psychological evaluation and therapeutic intervention. Each exchange reinforced my growing confidence that I could successfully refuse her authority without appearing unprofessional or mentally unstable. Eventually, Dr. Richards concluded the meeting with what felt like a strategic retreat rather than acceptance of my position. I think we should schedule regular check-ins over the next few months to monitor your workplace satisfaction and stress levels, she said, making notes that suggested she was developing alternative strategies for psychological evaluation rather than abandoning her therapeutic agenda. I don't believe regular psychological evaluation is necessary or appropriate, I replied, maintaining the firm but professional tone that had characterized my responses throughout our conversation. I'm committed to working with Director Brooks on specific performance development strategies, and I believe that approach will be more effective for addressing workplace challenges. Her expression suggested frustration with my continued resistance to her authority, but she couldn't openly object to my preference for traditional performance management without revealing the psychological manipulation that had been motivating her approach. Well, my door is always open if you change your mind about additional support resources, she said, clearly hoping that future workplace stress might make me more receptive to therapeutic intervention. Walking back to my desk after this confrontation, I felt a sense of liberation that I hadn't experienced since the early days of recognizing Jake's psychological manipulation. By refusing to accept Richard's therapeutic frameworks and maintaining clear boundaries around psychological evaluation, I had successfully protected my professional autonomy and demonstrated that her authority was not absolute or unquestionable. The remainder of that week was characterized by a noticeable shift in workplace dynamics. As word spread that I had successfully resisted the employee relations manager's recommendations for therapeutic intervention, several colleagues approached me privately to express admiration for my willingness to challenge what some of them had privately viewed as inappropriate psychological evaluation in professional context. Maya was particularly supportive when I shared a carefully edited version of my conversations with Dr. Richards and Director Brooks. "I'm really impressed with how you handled that," she said, during one of our coffee meetings. "I've been feeling uncomfortable with some of the psychological analysis that's been happening around here, but I didn't know how to address it professionally." Her validation was especially meaningful because it confirmed that my concerns about inappropriate therapeutic evaluation weren't paranoid or defensive, but reflected legitimate professional boundaries that other employees had also recognized as important, but hadn't known how to articulate or defend. More significantly, my successful resistance to Dr. Richard's psychological manipulation seemed to inspire other colleagues to question therapeutic frameworks that had been applied to their own workplace behavior. Over the following weeks, several team members began expressing preference for traditional professional development approaches over psychological analysis, creating a collective resistance to therapeutic evaluation that made it more difficult for Dr. Richards to pathologize individual employees. The 3-week follow-up meeting with Director Brooks provided an opportunity to demonstrate that traditional performance management was indeed more effective than therapeutic intervention for addressing workplace challenges. I presented evidence of improved engagement in team meetings, more effective client presentations, and enhanced collaboration on design projects, all achieved through the concrete strategies we had developed together rather than psychological insight or therapeutic support. This is exactly the kind of progress I was hoping to see, Director Brooks said, reviewing documentation of my professional development over the past month. Your approach to addressing performance concerns has been thorough and effective. His positive assessment of my improvement through traditional performance management created a powerful counter-narrative to Dr. Richards' claims that psychological intervention was necessary for addressing my workplace challenge. More importantly, it demonstrated that professional competence could be accurately measured and enhanced without therapeutic evaluation or mental health speculation. During our conversation, Director Brooks mentioned that he had received feedback from Dr. Richards about my resistance to employee assistance resources, but he seemed more interested in the concrete evidence of improved performance than in psychological interpretations of my motivations or mental health status. She suggested that your reluctance to engage with therapeutic support might indicate underlying issues that could affect your long-term career development, he said, clearly feeling obligated to share her concerns while also recognizing the validity of my alternative approach. I understand her perspective, I replied diplomatically, but I believe the evidence demonstrates that traditional professional development has been effective for addressing the challenges we identify. I'm committed to continuing this approach and welcome ongoing feedback about my workplace contribution. Director Brooks seemed satisfied with this response and concluded our meeting with renewed confidence in my professional trajectory and contributions to the design team. More importantly, he didn't pressure me to reconsider therapeutic intervention or suggest that Dr. Richards' psychological concerns should override the evidence of improved performance through traditional methods. The success of this performance management approach created momentum for addressing the broader issue of Dr. Richards' inappropriate psychological evaluation. Over the following months, I began documenting instances where therapeutic frameworks were being inappropriately applied to workplace challenges, building a case for organizational policy changes that would establish clearer boundaries between professional development and mental health services. This documentation process revealed that my experience was not unique, but rather part of a pattern where Dr. Richards had been using psychological evaluation to pathologize normal workplace stress and professional challenges experienced by multiple employees. Several colleagues had been pressured into therapeutic intervention for problems that could have been more appropriately addressed through traditional performance management and professional development. Armed with this evidence, I approached TechFlow's executive leadership with recommendations for policy changes that would protect employee privacy and autonomy while maintaining appropriate support for workplace wellness. My proposal included guidelines for distinguishing between professional development needs and mental health concerns, protocols for ensuring that psychological evaluation remained voluntary rather than coercive, and requirements for transparency about potential conflicts of interest in therapeutic relationships. The executive team was receptive to these recommendations, particularly after I provided evidence that traditional performance management had been more effective than therapeutic intervention for addressing workplace challenges throughout the organization. They agreed to implement policy changes that would establish clearer boundaries around psychological evaluation while maintaining comprehensive employee support services. Richard's initial appointment as Employee Relations Manager, TechFlow announced organizational restructuring that would separate employee wellness services from performance management and professional development. Richards would continue to provide voluntary therapeutic support through the Employee Assistance Program, but she would no longer have authority to evaluate workplace performance or influence personnel decisions through psychological assessment. This organizational change represented a significant victory for workplace autonomy and professional boundaries, but more importantly, it provided protection for other employees who might otherwise have been subjected to inappropriate psychological manipulation and professional contact. The policy changes we implemented became a model for other organizations seeking to provide comprehensive employee support while respecting individual privacy and professional autonomy. My own career trajectory continued to advance as I focused on developing expertise in user experience design and building leadership skills through traditional professional development approaches. The promotion to creative director that I had been working toward was formalized 8 months later, based on documented evidence of professional growth and contributions, rather than psychological assessments of my personality or mental health status. Perhaps most significantly, The experience of successfully resisting psychological manipulation in the workplace provided me with skills and confidence that enhanced my personal relationships and overall life satisfaction. By refusing to accept therapeutic frameworks that pathologized my responses to legitimate stress and professional challenges, I had learned to trust my own perceptions and advocate for my boundaries, even when facing institutional pressure and psychological authority. The relationship with Jake and the subsequent workplace situation with Dr. Richards had taught me that psychological manipulation could appear in many forms and contexts, but it always relied on convincing victims that their own perceptions and judgments were fundamentally flawed. By learning to recognize and resist these dynamics, I had developed resilience that would serve me well in all areas of my life. Looking back on this period from the perspective of several years later, I recognize that the challenge of confronting Richard's psychological manipulation was ultimately transformative in ways that went far beyond protecting my career. It required me to develop skills for articulating boundaries clearly and professionally, advocating for my rights within institutional contexts, and maintaining confidence in my own judgment, even when facing authoritative psychological. The experience also highlighted the importance of supporting others who might be facing similar challenges. The policy changes we implemented at TechFlow helped protect numerous colleagues from inappropriate psychological evaluation, and the documentation we developed became a resource for other organizations seeking to establish appropriate boundaries between employee wellness and performance management. Most importantly, successfully resisting psychological manipulation in both personal and professional contexts taught me that authentic relationships and career success are built on mutual respect and clear boundaries, rather than psychological analysis and therapeutic insight. By refusing to accept frameworks that positioned me as psychologically problematic, I had created space for genuine growth and development based on my own values and goals, rather than someone else's interpretation of my mental health or interpersonal patterns. The skills I developed during this challenging period continue to serve me well as a creative director, where I regularly navigate complex interpersonal dynamics and organizational challenges. My experience with psychological manipulation has made me more sensitive to similar dynamics in work relationships and more committed to creating environments where professional development is based on concrete performance and collaborative problem solving, rather than psychological speculation. Today, I live with confidence that I can recognize and resist psychological manipulation in any form it might take, whether in personal relationships, professional contexts, or other areas of life. The boundaries I learned to establish and maintain during this difficult period have become a foundation for authentic success and genuine satisfaction that no amount of psychological analysis could undermine or improve. The half-painted hallway in my loft, which had symbolized violated boundaries during my relationship with Jake, was eventually repainted in a color I chose myself, representing my reclaimed autonomy and the freedom to make decisions about my own space and life without requiring anyone else's psychological approval or therapeutic insight. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.